Hello and welcome back to Christie's Cozy Corner. And today's video is of course going to be my August reading wrap up. So for the month of August, I read a total of 8 things. However, a bunch of them were admittedly novellas, so I didn't actually read that much. But if we consider it from a quality perspective, it was a fantastic reading month. So everything that I read this month was pretty much in the fantasy or sci-fi realm. So this time I'm just gonna go through everything in the order that I read them, starting with the first book that I completed, which was Nettle and Bone by T. Kingfisher. So I read this book as well as some other T. Kingfisher books as part of a little 24-hour reading challenge that I did for myself. And the reason why I did that challenge was because up until the midpoint of August, I still had not finished a single book yet. So I was like, I need to get on it. I picked up a couple of short things, but also things that I've been meaning to get to for a while. So Nettle and Bone was the first book that I picked up for that readathon. So if you're interested in watching that vlog where I go through more in-depth thoughts about these books, or watch me slowly lose my mind in the wee hours of morning because I did try to stay up as long as possible so I could read for the full 24 hours. I did fall asleep for 2 hours in between, but I really tried my best. So I will insert a link to that vlog if you want to see that. So yes, Nettle and Bone by T. Kingfisher, which I gave 4.5 stars. I enjoyed this book immensely. Up until this point, I've read 2 T. Kingfisher books, and I feel like I have gotten like a pretty good grasp of what her writing style is, and it's definitely the same kind of writing style or authorial voice that permeates throughout all her works, and it just works so well for me because it's just this really witty and charming sense of humor that she has in all her stories, and all her protagonists and characters are so relatable. Really charming is just the best word that I can use to describe T. Kingfisher. And I feel like if you don't like one of her works, or at least you don't like her writing style, then probably nothing else is going to work either, because it is such a strong kind of voice or style that she has throughout all her books. So Nettle and Bone is about the main character Mara, who is a princess and the third daughter of this royal family, and her eldest sister has been married off to this neighboring kingdom so they can secure an alliance, but something happens to her eldest sister and she ends up dying. So they end up having to marry the second daughter off as well to make sure that they continue to secure this alliance. And Mara is just not having it. Given what happened to her eldest sister, she's worried about the safety of her second sister as well. So she sets off on this quest to try to save her sister from whatever fate is going to befall her. And this is very much a quest kind of story where she puts together this group that she goes on this journey with to try to save her sister. And everyone in this group is just so great. You have this dust wife who is like this old curmudgeon-y kind of hedge witch, and you also have this fairy godmother who is just the cutest, sweetest thing. And of course, you have the disgraced knight character who is like kind of a love interest. And there's like a very light romantic subplot to this, which I enjoyed so much. And then you also have Bone Dog, her animal companion, because T. Kingfisher is just amazing at writing animal companions. So yeah, I love this book a lot, and all the main characters are pretty much older in age. Mara herself is 30 years old, although she doesn't always read like a 30-year-old. She is very naive and sheltered, but like I feel like that's fine because a lot of times 30-year-olds don't act like how you think 30-year-olds are supposed to act, because we all have no idea what we're doing, okay? And the reason why I didn't give this book a full 5 stars was because I just wanted like a little more when it came to the romance, and I think that just really comes down to my own expectations, because when I went into this, I thought there would be a little bit more to the romance, but it's really just like a really light subplot, although I still really liked it. So yeah, 4.5 stars for this book. The next book that I read right after that was What Moves the Dead, also by T. Kingfisher, and this one I gave a full 5 stars to. This is like a historical gothic horror with like a hint of fantasy, because while it is in our real world, there are made-up countries, so I guess you can call it like alternate historical, if that is even a thing. And the reason why I love this book so much was because I feel like this is the exact perfect kind of horror for me. Like, the entity that is the horror part is just perfect for me. And I don't know if I should say what that entity is, because I feel like it is kind of a spoiler because that's part of the mystery surrounding it. So just to be safe, I won't say what it is and you'll just have to find out. But I really love the main character as well. This one is told in first person and they just have that same signature witty T. Kingfisher kind of humor. Like the story is obviously very dark because there's some creepy things that are happening, but I also love how the main character just makes everything feel kind of lighter sometimes with their occasional sarcastic quips. And another thing that I really love about this one is that because they're in these fictional countries, these countries have their own culture and customs. And the use of different pronouns that they have in this language was just so interesting and fascinating, and also just so natural in their language. And after reading this book, it just really showed me that Gothic horrors are probably my favorite kind of horrors, and I definitely want to read more of them. The next book that I read as part of that same 24-hour reading vlog was Bryony and Roses, again by T. Kingfisher. And this one is probably the least favorite of all the books that I read in that vlog, which I read a total of 4, but I still gave it a 3.5 stars because it was still quite enjoyable. The only thing about it was I just feel like there was nothing that really stood out to me about this one that made it super unique, and it was altogether just a little bit forgettable. This one is a Beauty and the Beast retelling, and it starts off with our main character, Bryony, stumbling upon this mansion as she is in need of shelter, and she obviously ends up getting trapped in it and meets the Beast character, and they go through this whole thing where the Beast assures that her family will be taken care of, but she has to stay with him in this mansion. So really kind of typical Beauty and the Beast retelling, but I really liked the main characters. I thought their dynamic together was really great. They had a lot of fun banter, and it was just really nice to see them slowly get to know each other and bond over each other's hobbies. Bryony is a huge gardener, so she starts to maintain a garden within the grounds of the mansion, and the Beast helps her as well, and it's just so cute. They also bond over their mutual love of bad poetry, and those parts were really fun. I also really liked the house itself as a character as well because it really had its own distinct personality. And while this book wasn't anything particularly special, it was just a lot of fun, and it kept me awake because I think at this point in the readathon I was just slowly getting tired and losing it. And finally, the last book I read in those 24 hours was A Wizard's Guide to Defensive Baking by T. Kingfisher. And this one is a middle grade about the main character, Mona, who is a wizard, except in this world, wizards have very specialized powers, and Mona's power happens to be that she's really good at baking. Like, she just has this special touch that can transform dough into exactly what she needs it to be, like making it extra delicious. So her aunt's bakery, which is where she works, is just really famous for having all of these delicious kinds of treats. And this book opens up with Mona stumbling upon a dead body in her aunt's bakery when she's opening up, and she gets roped up in the investigation. As she starts to investigate this on her own, she realizes that there might be someone who is specifically targeting the wizards of this city, and she's trying to unravel that mystery. This book again was just so freaking adorable. Like, it was just so cute. And like I mentioned before about T. Kingfisher's animal companions, this one had a giant bucket of sourdough starter that was sentient, and it was just great. Its name was Bob because it's just this giant blob of dough that's a sourdough starter. And there's also little gingerbread men that she communicates with and instructs what to do, and it's just so cute. And this one, now that I think about it, just really reminds me of a cozy Studio Ghibli movie because you have these two main characters who have magical powers and they're in a bakery. I don't know, it just has that vibe, So, oh yeah, I gave this one 4 stars. Although I will say that the climax of this book was actually like a lot bigger than I thought. Like, it was actually super intense, I think, especially for a middle grade, and I don't know, it was just a great time. And next, I finally finished Dark Age by Pierce Brown. I mean, did I finish this book or did this book finish me? And this book was the culprit of why I didn't finish anything in the first half of August, because I was just slowly chipping away at this one. Not that I didn't like it, because I gave it 5 stars in the end, but I do feel like 2/3 of this was kind of a slog, which surprises me even more that I gave it 5 stars in the end. So this book is of course the 5th book in the Red Rising saga, and originally I picked this up because I was reading it as part of the 5-star treasure hunt readathon for Jessie May's Patreon. Clearly did not finish it in time for the readathon, although I did include the beginning parts of it in the vlog I did for that readathon, so I will also link that. So the first part of this book I feel like was the biggest struggle for me because it was just this huge battle that was happening, and it was just a lot of back and forth between perspectives, but just going through the same thing. So it was getting kind of tiring. It was getting kind of boring just being there. But then as soon as we hit part 2, it started picking up more because we introduced some more perspective. But there are 2 characters whose perspectives I just really did not care for. These were the new characters that were introduced in Iron Gold, the first book in this like second era of this saga. So I still kind of went through that kind of slowly, but I will say that both of them ended up growing on me so much by like the last third of this book. And by the last third of this book, I was just completely on board with everything and everyone, and it was a great time. I loved that last third of this book so freaking much. And like the battle and the climax and the conclusion were just so incredible. Like that last third of this book is why I gave this book 5 stars. And honestly, up until this point, I wasn't the hugest fan of Darrow either. Like I really did not like him in the first and second book. He got a little bit better for me in the third book, and even a little bit better from that in the 4th book. But then by this 5th book, I was like, okay, I kind of really like Darrow now. Like, he is actually pretty awesome. And I don't know if it's because I'm already like on the 5th book and it's just got a kind of Stockholm syndrome hold on me or something, why I like Darrow now. But again, it's because of that last third of this book. And I feel like if anything could get me to like Darrow, like it deserves the 5 stars. But also, if you watch that reading vlog where I started reading this book, you'll know that I had a lot of complaints for this book as well, and I feel like it's the same complaints that I have about this whole series and about Pierce Brown's writing in general. I've kind of just gotten used to it, so I've been able to kind of look past a little bit, but it's still stuff that bothers me sometimes. It's 2 things in particular. Firstly, I know that he is not someone who is like an avid plotter or an outliner, so it really feels like sometimes plot lines just come out of completely nowhere. Like for some of the things and new plot lines that were introduced in this book, it felt like there was literally like 0 setup for it from the previous books, and it just came out of nowhere, and we just kind of go through it like, okay, like this is the new thing, this is the new path that we are going down, which is fine because it still ended up being really good and really interesting. But like when it's first introduced, I was just like, what the heck is this even doing here? And then the other part of his writing that really gets to me, when new characters get introduced, like they were kind of mentioned in passing before, but then they finally show up. And you're supposed to believe that they have this like really strong connection and relationship with other characters. And like they're supposed to be super close and have this really emotional attachment. But as a reader, you don't really feel like that because again, there was just like no setup for it. So it really just feels like a lot of tell, not show when it comes to the relationship between these characters, and you just don't feel any of that connection or investment in them that I think you're supposed to at that point in the story. I don't know. To me, the way it reads, it just feels like a weakness in the writing itself. But anyway, I still gave this book 5 stars, okay? I really, really liked it. And then next, I finished The Bands of Mourning by Brandon Sanderson, the 3rd book in Mistborn Era 2. And this one I gave 4.5 stars. So I gave Shadows of Self 5 stars because that one was just amazing and I loved it so much. And I still really like this one too, hence a 4 4.5-star rating, but I just didn't love it as much as Shadows of Self, because I feel like Shadows of Self just had more like incredible explosive moments. Like I think like the last third or even the last half of Shadows of Self all happened within like a single night, and it was just so propulsive going through all the different perspectives and everything that's happening to each of the characters in that night. One thing that I really like about this series, and I think I mentioned it both times when I talked about the first 2 books in Era 2, is how technology has evolved in this world and how they have to introduce new laws to accommodate the changing times. And it's just so fascinating to read about from a political and economic standpoint, because I feel like it's not something that a lot of other fantasy series tackles. But because Mistborn in general spans such a long period of time, and especially in this era where you're in a very turn of the century industrial revolution kind of time period, like that is when you specifically see all these different kinds of things happening. And it's just really interesting. And the characters continue to be an absolute delight, especially Steris in this one. Steris in this book was just so adorable and she was so cute. I love Steris so much, which I mentioned in the previous video that I just did talking about some of my favorite characters. And Steris is definitely one of my favorite characters now. My favorite character in Era 2 is still Marcy. I just love Marcy so much, but Steris is like a very, very close second. Wayne, however, I admit, kind of annoyed me in this one because there were just some things that he said. I was just like, why, Wayne? Like, I know a lot of things that he says are kind of questionable and makes you wonder, like, why do you even open your mouth at all? But the things in this one particularly that he says, I'm like, you shut your mouth right now, young man, before I punch you in the face, is how I felt about him in this one. And also in this book, there were a bunch of new things that were introduced. And again, I just cannot fathom anyone ever skipping Era 2 because it's such a pivotal part of the story. And I know I mentioned in my September TBR that I will be reading Secret History next and then jumping right into The Lost Metal. But then I heard that it's best to read as much as you can of the Cosmere before going into The Lost Metal. So unfortunately, I do have to redact that little part of my September TBR. So instead of going right into The Lost Metal after Secret History, I'll have to pick up a few other things first. And after Bands of Mourning, I read Emily Wilde's Encyclopaedia of Faeries by Feather Fawcett. And this title is always such a mouthful to say. But this book was definitely a new favorite, and for sure one of my favorites that I've read this year. I gave this book 5 stars, and it was just such a fun time. It's about the main character, Emily Wilde, who is putting together an encyclopedia of different kinds of fairies. And in the beginning of this book, she travels to, I think in like Norway, to study about a specific kind of fairy that no one has ever written about. And she's going to write about it in like an academic paper. And this book is told in journal entries as she documents her journey and this process. And I just love Emily so much because she, again, is just so relatable. Like, she's not very good with people and not very good with social norms and customs. So she always like inadvertently offends them without meaning to. But at the same time, she's like, why do people have to be so complicated and go through all these different dances? Like, why can't they just be more straightforward? Especially because she also relates more to the fae, or in this world, they call them the folk. She relates to them much more than the humans because of their perceived strange ways. And the more I read these kinds of stories, the more I discover about myself as a reader and how I actually really love stories about fae, but specifically the kind of fae that you read about in like myths and folklores, like the creepy, trickster, evil, sinister kind of fae. And one of my favorite parts about this book was the different kinds of folklore stories that it tells. And also, this book has footnotes because she is writing in her journal and she's like citing different things. And honestly, I love footnotes. I know not everybody loves footnotes, but to me, it just like sprinkles a little bit extra to the story, and I just love it. And of course, I have to talk about Bamblebee. Wendell Bamblebee, who I added as the newest addition to my list of favorite characters because I just love him so much. He is basically Howl from Howl's Moving Castle, and I freaking love Howl. Bamblebee is this rich, spoiled man who is so dumb sometimes and so silly, and you can tell that he really likes and cares for Emily, but he just goes about it in the most ridiculous ways, and I just love how it annoys her, if anything. The relationship between Bamblebee and Emily is definitely the best part of this book, and there were just so many hilarious moments that had me laughing out loud, and it was so fun. It was just such an entertaining time, but I will admit some of the journal entries are definitely a little bit more on the dull side because she does document a lot of like the daily, mundane, day-to-day stuff that she does, so I can see why that would be kind of boring. But I listened to this on audiobook and I feel like it works a lot better on audiobook, especially if you find those parts boring, because then you can kind of let the audiobook help you through that. So if you tried Emily Wilde and you DNF'd it because you just couldn't get into the story, I definitely recommend trying it again, but listening to the audiobook instead, because the audiobook was really, really good. And finally, the last book that I finished in August was Edgedancer by Brandon Sanderson, the novella 2.5 between Words of Radiance and Oathbringer. And I can definitely see why people say you absolutely have to read this novella before you go into Oathbringer, because it introduces characters and valuable context that is very prominent in Oathbringer, which I'm currently reading, so I can see like why that was necessary. And of course, the one thing that everybody wants to know when you read Edgedancer is, what are your thoughts on Lift? And personally, I freaking love her. Like, okay, she is definitely so freaking annoying, especially in the first half of Edgedancer. Like, I just feel like she is this irritating little sister that just gets on your nerves and never knows when to shut up, and sometimes you want to throttle her. But she's also so endearing and charming in her own way, and I just have a lot of fun with her. Again, so many insanely funny moments, and I know Sanderson's humor does not work for everyone, but I feel like I am like the target audience for Sanderson humor because it just works on me every single time. Like the fact that Lift makes people call her your pancake fullness, like it's just so insanely ridiculous that I cannot help but laugh. And it's things like this and other scenes that I have read in the previous Stormlight Archive books that just baffles me so much. Like, okay, maybe baffle is not the right word, but it just surprises me, like the amount of praise and prestige surrounding this series. Like, don't get me wrong, I definitely love it, and it's for sure one of my favorite fantasy series, but sometimes I just can't believe that this is like Brandon Sanderson's big, sweeping, epic, his magnum opus, and the amount of respect that it gets, and then you have like these totally ridiculous scenes that are just like so stupid and so silly, but they're so funny, and it's just like, what the heck is something like that doing in this grand epic series like this? But you know, it is Sanderson, and this is definitely like very Sanderson kind of style. So yeah, Edgedancer I gave 4 stars. I really liked it, and I really enjoy Lift as a character. And as I'm reading Oathbringer, I really look forward to any scene that has Lift in it. Okay, my camera is about to die, so I will just mention the one book that I DNF'd this month, and that is Practice Makes Perfect by Sarah Adams. And this one is a contemporary romance that kind of has fake dating, except it's not really dating. It's more like the male love interest is teaching the female main character like how to date, so they're kind of like going on these pretend kinds of dates, I guess. I DNF'd this at around like before the first third of the book because I just realized I did not care about these characters at all. It is the second book in a series though, but I feel like when it comes to romance books, even though they are part of a series, they read more like companion novels to each other, so I didn't feel like I had to read the first book before I read the second one, although maybe I should have, because these characters were probably introduced already in the first book. And I feel like they just were not really well established in the second book, maybe because they were already introduced in that first book. Okay, so my camera battery died at this point, but luckily I had the foresight to record my outro first when I first saw that battery flashing sign, so yay. But yeah, anyway, so I'll just briefly talk a little bit more about this book and why I DNF'd it. Like I said, the characters just really didn't feel that well established, and maybe it's because I didn't read the first book first, but to be honest, I think even if I did read the first book, I still wouldn't like this one anyway, because in the first third of it that I read, like the majority of the time, the two characters were literally just thirsting after each other, and I just did not feel a single thing for either of them. And there just really wasn't any chemistry between them. Like anytime they saw each other, they would just both be so drawn towards how the other person looks. And especially in like the male character's perspective, he is that kind of character who is like, I shouldn't be involved with her, but oh no, like I can't help it. Like I can't help myself. And like, dude, you're a grown man, have some self-control, you can totally help yourself. But even though he says that, he's still like, I can't get involved with her. Like, okay, whatever, dude. Anyway, so yeah, I DNF'd it. Okay, that's it for this one. So that is it for this video. All of the books that I read in the month of August. Currently in September, I am reading Oathbringer, as I said I would in my September TBR, and I'm already over halfway through, so I feel like I'm making really good progress. So that is it for this video. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you again in my next one. Bye!